At a prestigious academic conference, some of the brightest young minds in America gathered. It was an event where scholars showcased their intellect and debated modern ideas. Among them was Barron Trump, a young man who had earned his place through academic excellence. Though many whispered that his last name was the real reason he was there, one of the most well-known speakers at the event was Professor Richard Anderson. He had built a reputation as a sharp, quick-witted academic who took pride in challenging traditional beliefs, particularly Christianity. His lectures were not just educational but theatrical, filled with biting sarcasm and an air of intellectual superiority. Faith, in his view, was nothing more than an outdated superstition, and he made sure his audience knew it. That morning, the lecture hall buzzed with anticipation. Students knew Anderson's lectures felt more like verbal duels, and they were eager to see who would be his next intellectual victim. But no one, least of all Anderson, expected the tables to turn. Anderson began as he always did, pacing in front of the room, his sharp gaze scanning the audience. His topic? The need to abandon outdated beliefs and embrace modern rationality. When his eyes landed on Barron Trump, a smirk formed at the corners of his mouth. Little did he know this would be a lecture he would never forget. "Let's address the elephant in the room," Anderson announced, folding his arms. Studies consistently show that as intelligence and education levels increase, religious belief declines. In simple terms, the smarter you are, the less likely you are to believe in supernatural fantasies. A few students chuckled nervously. Others shifted uncomfortably. On the screen behind him, a graph appeared, displaying a downward trend. "See this line?" Anderson continued, pointing at the screen. "This is what happens to faith when people become more educated. Fascinating, isn't it? Of course, some people find it harder to accept basic cognitive development, perhaps because of family traditions." His eyes flicked back to Barron, who sat calmly near the back. The remark was clearly directed at him, though he showed no visible reaction. Professor Thompson, another faculty member in the room, watched with concern. He had seen Anderson push the limits before, but this time it felt personal. Anderson wasn't just discussing an idea, he was ridiculing anyone who disagreed with him. "You know what truly amazes me?" Anderson continued, his tone thick with sarcasm. "In this room, we have some of the best young minds in the country, future scientists, leaders, thinkers. And yet, I guarantee that some of you still hold on to these ancient superstitions, unable to break free from your intellectual chains." Barron remained motionless, his expression unreadable. Unlike the other students who either laughed awkwardly or looked down at their desks, he held Anderson's gaze with unwavering composure. This only seemed to fuel the professor's contempt. "Tell me," Anderson challenged, removing his glasses and leaning forward on the podium, "what does it say about someone's intellect when they still believe in an invisible sky god in 2025? When their cognitive development is so stunted that they need fairy tales to explain the world?" His gaze locked onto Barron. "Perhaps one of our more politically connected students would like to enlighten us." The room fell silent. The tension was thick. Students watched, unsure of what would happen next. Then Barron stood up. "Actually, Professor," he said, his voice calm and measured, "I'd be happy to address your concerns about cognitive development." A smirk spread across Anderson's face. Well, well. Young Mr. Trump wants to educate us about intellectual capacity." He gestured dramatically. "Please, enlighten us on how your God fits into a world of quantum physics and artificial intelligence." Barron remained unshaken. "First," he said, "I find it interesting that someone who champions intellectual discourse prefers mockery over actual academic discussion. A few students gasped. Others murmured in approval. Anderson's smirk faltered slightly. This wasn't the hesitant, flustered response he had expected. "Oh, please," Anderson interrupted, rolling his eyes. "Spare us the Sunday school lessons. I've spent 30 years studying cognitive development. Are you suggesting you know better?" "I'm suggesting," Barron replied, his voice gaining strength, "that your bias is showing, Professor. You claim to follow the evidence, yet you ignore the countless brilliant minds throughout history who have reconciled faith and reason. Newton, Planck, Collins." Anderson scoffed. "Ancient history," he muttered. "Is God a magician too? Is that what you're going to tell us next?" Barron stood straighter. "What's fascinating, Professor, is that while you mock faith, you display your own form of religious devotion at blind faith in your own intellectual superiority. You've created your own dogma where anyone who disagrees with you is automatically considered ignorant." The room fell silent. Professor Thompson leaned forward, watching Anderson's face redden. He had never seen anyone challenge Anderson this way, certainly not a student. Anderson's next words came out almost as a snarl. "Fine, Mr. Trump. You want a debate? Let's debate. Come down here and explain to us all how your medieval beliefs hold up against scientific scrutiny. Show us this superior intellect of yours." As Barron made his way to the front of the room, no one could have predicted what would happen next, least of all Professor Anderson. Barron stood confidently at the front, facing Anderson and the expectant crowd. "Since you mentioned quantum physics earlier, let's start there," he said. "You claim faith is incompatible with science, yet quantum mechanics has shown us that reality is far stranger than our limited human minds can comprehend." Anderson scoffed. "Oh, please. Don't try to use quantum mechanics to justify I'm not finished, Professor," Barron said politely but firmly. "You spoke about cognitive development, so let's discuss that. You argue that belief in God correlates with lower intelligence, yet research has shown that faith often correlates with higher resilience, stronger community bonds, and better mental health outcomes." Anderson's expression twitched. This wasn't going according to plan. "Correlation doesn't equal causation," Anderson snapped. "Exactly my point," Barron said. "Yet, you had no problem implying causation earlier when it suited your argument." A murmur ran through the audience. Students who had initially smirked at Anderson's confidence were now leaning in, genuinely engaged. Barron continued, "You claim science and faith are incompatible, yet some of the greatest scientific minds, Kepler, Galileo, Pascal, were devout believers. Are you saying their intelligence was lacking? Or is it possible that faith and reason can coexist?" Anderson opened his mouth, but for the first time, he hesitated. He had underestimated Barron. This wasn't just some privileged kid writing on his family name. He was prepared, logical, and unshaken. Professor Thompson observed in quiet admiration. This was not how he expected the lecture to unfold, but he recognized something significant happening. Barron wasn't just defending faith, he was challenging intellectual arrogance itself. ASE, the date continued. One thing became clear: Professor Anderson's usual tactics of ridicule and dismissal were failing him. And for the first time, in a room where he was used to commanding respect, he found himself on the defensive. That day, the lecture hall witnessed something rare. A student had stood his ground, not through anger or mockery, but through reason and composure. And in doing so, he had left even the most skeptical minds questioning what they thought they knew. When Barron spoke, the entire room fell silent. The discussion had taken an unexpected turn, and the audience was completely engaged. Professor Thompson watched closely, noticing how his colleague Professor Anderson was no longer smirking with confidence. Instead, his expression grew tense. Barron continued, his voice calm but firm. You're not really angry at God or religion. What truly bothers you is what you perceive as intellectual weakness. But let me ask you something which is more honest, admitting there are things we don't yet understand or claiming with absolute certainty that we have all the answers. Professor Anderson's face turned red. He opened his mouth to respond, but Barron wasn't finished. When you mock faith, you're not just mocking me or my beliefs. You're mocking the billions of people throughout history who have found meaning, purpose, and deep truth in their faith. That includes many of the very scientists whose work you rely on today. The room was tense. Earlier, some students had laughed at Anderson's dismissal of religion, but now those same students watched Barron with growing respect. The shift in the atmosphere was undeniable. Barron took a step closer to the podium. His eyes locked on Anderson's. So tell me, Professor, what truly shows a lack of intellectual development? Believing in a higher power or thinking that mockery is a substitute for a real discussion? The room held its breath. Anderson hesitated, gripping the podium. You're twisting my words, he said, his voice unsteady. Science has explained everything that religion once called divine intervention. Barron tilted his head. Has it? Then perhaps you can explain consciousness, the very experience of being self-aware, or the origin of life itself, or why the universe seems perfectly fine-tuned for life. Those are just gaps in our knowledge, Anderson shot back. Exactly, Barron replied instantly. Gaps in our knowledge. Yet, you're absolutely certain that no divine force exists within those gaps. Isn't that, in itself, a kind of blind faith? The students sat up straighter. Some, who had initially agreed with Anderson, were now nodding along with Barron's argument. Barron's voice remained steady. You say that faith is a crutch for weak minds. But here you are using your academic position to ridicule those who think differently than you. Tell me, Professor, which one of us is really afraid? Anderson's face darkened. Now listen here. No, Professor, you listen, Barron interrupted, his tone still respectful but unwavering. You claim to promote free thinking, yet you mock those who dare to think differently from you. You claim intellectual superiority while showing intellectual intolerance. A murmur rippled through the audience. Professor Thompson, shifting uncomfortably in his seat, could see the impact of Barron's words. Anderson's carefully built authority was crumbling before everyone's eyes. Barron paused, letting his words settle. Then he asked, if belief in God is a sign of low intelligence, then why does it threaten you so much? Anderson opened his mouth, but nothing came out. The silence in the room was overwhelming. The professor, who had spent years intimidating students with his sharp wit and dismissive remarks, was now at a loss for words. Barron continued, delivering his final point. I'll tell you why you're threatened, Professor. Deep down, you realize that your entire worldview is built on a contradiction. Anderson's grip on the podium tightened. What contradiction? You claim to follow evidence and reason, yet you make the absolute claim that God cannot exist, even though proving a negative is scientifically impossible. Your certainty isn't based on reason, it's based on dogma. The color drained from Anderson's face. Students who had been taking notes had stopped writing altogether, now fully engrossed in what they were witnessing. Barron pressed on. You criticize people for finding meaning in faith, yet you've turned your atheism into a belief system of its own. You preach it with the same passion you condemn in believers. You haven't abandoned faith, you've simply replaced God with your own intellect. Some students nodded, others exchanged glances. Even those who had sided with Anderson were beginning to reconsider. Barron leaned slightly forward. But here's the biggest contradiction of all. You claim that believing in God is a sign of lesser intelligence. Yet you, a professor, are struggling to counter the arguments of a mere student. So which is it? Are believers truly inferior, or are you simply unprepared? The silence was absolute. Anderson's mouth opened and closed, but no response came. His reputation had been built on the idea that faith and intelligence were incompatible. Now, in front of his own students, that belief had been shattered. Then Barron asked one last question. You argue that faith in God is irrational. Yet you have faith that consciousness came from unconscious matter, that life arose from nothing, that order somehow emerged from chaos, all without any guiding force. So tell me, Professor, which belief actually requires more blind faith? Anderson's expression said it all. He had no answer. And that was when he realized his mistake in challenging Barron. The room remained frozen in stunned silence. Anderson stood there, gripping the podium, his carefully curated arguments in shambles. The students, once entertained by his dismissive remarks on religion, were now looking at Barron with admiration. For the next half hour, Anderson tried to continue his lecture, but the damage had been done. His voice, usually so confident, now wavered with hesitation. Students stole glances at Barron, their respect for him obvious. The authority that Anderson had wielded for years had been permanently shaken. When the lecture finally ended, the usual chatter of students gathering their belongings was replaced with whispers of excitement. Some students even clapped for Barron as he walked toward the exit. Others simply stared, still processing what had just happened. Professor Thompson approached Anderson, who remained frozen behind the podium, staring blankly at his notes. "Richard," he said gently, "maybe this is a chance for some reflection." Anderson just nodded, still lost in thought. The once powerful professor had been reduced to a man questioning everything he had once believed. Later that afternoon, long after the lecture hall had emptied, Anderson sat alone, staring at his notes. 30 years of dismissing faith as foolishness had just been undone by one student's unwavering belief. "Excuse me, Professor." It was Barron, stopping by before he left. Anderson looked up. There was no longer arrogance in his eyes, just something softer. "Respect. You know," Anderson admitted quietly, "in all my years of teaching, no one has ever made me question my own certainty like you did today." Barron smiled. "Sometimes the strongest arguments for faith come from those who try to destroy it." Anderson nodded slowly. "Maybe," he murmured. "Maybe the truly closed minds aren't the ones who believe in God, but the ones who mock those who do." That day became legendary, not just because Barron Trump defended his faith so eloquently, but because it proved that faith and intelligence are not enemies. They are partners in the search for truth.